This is a very brief focus on one of the five wisdom literature books of the Old Testament, and it's on the book of Job. The famous French writer Victor Hugo said of this Old Testament book, "Tomorrow, if all literature was to be destroyed and it was left to me to retain one work only, I should save Job." This is from the writer of Les Miserables, one of a great work of literature, and he felt so highly about this Old Testament book. He had that much to say, which was echoed also by the British poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, who called the book of Job the greatest poem, whether of ancient or modern literature. So spanning all of time now. His opinion, like Victor Hugo's, was that this one was absolutely the best. Daniel Webster, you may recognize the name from one of the famous English dictionaries. The Book of Job, taken as a mere work of literary genius, is one of the most wonderful productions of any age or of any language. Again, high praise. And that's why I want to spend a few minutes on this work. Mr. Webster praises its form, its literary form. But of course, it's not just that makes it remarkable, or the story that's involved in it, but it's also the content of the wisdom, the discussion of important human conditions and ideas and solutions. Of course, as we said, the Book of Job takes its place as it was collected by the Hebrew people. It was placed among one of the five books commonly referred to books of poetry: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs of Solomon. And these were called such because they're written in poetic style, in contrast to the other books we've looked at that were in prose and were in narrative style. There is story and narrative in the book of Job as well, at the beginning and at the end. And in the middle, the largest part of the book of Job, which is 42 chapters long, the first two chapters and the last chapter are actually in prose, while the other 39 are in poetry. So it's kind of an interesting mix. Wisdom literature, poetic literature, these are terms that are used for these particular five books, and the book of Job was placed in ancient times among these five. The word sage, I'll introduce it quickly because while we are not going to look at all the dialogues and characters, we're only looking at a quick survey again of this book, but there are many sages that appear in the narrative and in the discussion and in the conversations in the book of Job. In ancient times, the role of a sage was one of a professional wise man that would be sought out, found at the gates of cities, and definitely they would be assembled around political leaders, kings, tribal leaders, etc. They would have an entourage, or they would have one or more of these sages. These sages sometimes held not just the position of advisor, but also as sometimes religious connotations. In ancient times, they didn't separate state and religion. So sometimes a sage would be not only an advisor in military or in political situations, but also a prophet and a priest, so dealing with connection with the divine. It was the sage, a role that's not just in among the Hebrew people. It was an international enterprise in ancient times to kind of have a think tank at the courts. And these, again, were seen as advisors, counselors, and they used their talents in various ways. You might recall Joseph in Egypt. He is assembled at the court of the Egyptian Pharaoh when it is found out that he has the ability, thanks to God, to interpret dreams and therefore to help out with policy and other aspects of decision making. There are there are two kinds of wisdom imparted among these ancient cultures. One can be seen at court, as I just mentioned other times. You see it in a local tribal family, so court wisdom, family wisdom. The book of Proverbs has both courtly wisdom and family wisdom. As we saw, it deals with marriage, and it deals with relationship of fathers and sons, etc. Even the hymn book, the songbook of the Hebrew people, the book of Psalms, has 12 wisdom texts, so to speak, in among its songs as well. There were collection of schools of sages in ancient times too. See the book of Daniel makes reference to those, but it is important to think these are not just people who could answer all the questions, pass a quiz, or whatever. They were very practical, not just academic, not just intellectual, not just for the ivory tower, but were meant to be important people that you could refer to for everyday life. So, how is Old Testament biblical literature different than, say, Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, other cultures of ancient times? How is it different? The wisdom literature that's in the Old Testament, and different from what might be seen as wisdom literature of our time as well, because there are books that are highly elevated by the New York Times list or others as important markers in Western civilization or postmodern times that you and I live in. Well, biblical literature differs from these man-praised works in a few things. Here's just a few items, three of them. First of all, biblical literature starts with God, ends with God. It is God-centered. God's at the middle of it, at the beginning and end of it. And it definitely, in a sense, excludes the possibility that somebody who does not believe in God, the atheist, can be wise ultimately, or can be deemed wise. Now, for sure, an atheist, a skeptic, a denier of the divine can be high IQ, can be brilliant, can be informed, but that's different than being wise. A biblical literature calls a person that's gifted with many intellectual talents, but then denies God or rejects God, calls him a fool. Secondly, biblical wisdom literature is very practical. It's not highfalutin. It does not speak to man in highfalutin language that has to be translated for the common person. It is very life-centered. It's about good life, living well. It's not just theoretical. You don't have to take a college graduate class to figure it out. It is there to help everyday man. It is there to help deliver a city from destruction. It is there for many reasons. It's there for practical reasons. Thirdly, biblical wisdom literature is a matter of choice. And I've pointed this out before, I guess. It's not just a capacity. It's not just a high IQ. Wisdom is what wisdom does, meaning it's not just passing a test. It's knowing and choosing to do what is right, what is known, what is truth. It's not an IQ. It is not a GPA. It is a quality of a person's life. So the biblical wisdom literature speaks of God. It's very practical, and it says, and now you must choose to do what you know to be true and best. Who wrote the book of Job? No one really knows. Oh, by the way, if we knew that, we could for sure place it in a certain century. But we don't really know. So there has to be a suggestion. And your instructor is going to leave you with where he stands, where I stand at the present moment. Jewish tradition attributes the book of Job to Moses, and if that were the case, then it would date around 1500 or the 15th century before Christ. I'm not going to go with that. but I don't, it's not an important point, but it's an ancient writing. Um, for sure, we know what is certain is that the author was a loyal Hebrew who was not strictly bound by popular creed that circulated among the Hebrew people that said that when you suffer, when any man, woman, child suffers, it's always a direct result of sin. In the uh, context of when Job lives, everybody seems to believe that if you something bad happens to you, you did something. There is a sin, or your parents did something. That is, there's a sin that is the result that results in human suffering. We're going to come back to that point in just a minute, but that is the context. That's an important idea that lives and is going to be dispelled or is going to be countered by God in this book of Job. Well, since we're not for sure that who wrote the book of Job, there's of course been a debate over the time that it comes from, because most of the wisdom literature books, the other four, date from around 1000 BC to around just after the fall of Jerusalem. So from 1000 BC to around the 6th century BC. So they come from those 4 centuries of the millennium, right, the early centuries of the millennium right before Christ. But I tend to go with before even Moses. Many think, and I do, that Job lived long before Moses, before 1500 BC. So I put in red around the time of the founder of the Hebrew people. So Abraham, among the earliest patriarchs of the Hebrew nation. So I'm going to, for testing purposes, go with 2000 before Christ as an approximate time period. About 4,000 years ago is when the story of Job comes from. There are others that put it around the time of Solomon, around the 10th century before Christ, because there was a lot of outpouring of this kind of literature, poetic literature, around this time. But that is not a convincing argument. One more thing. It is not a made-up story. Just because we can't be sure exactly who wrote it, the date, not knowing the date for sure, does not nullify its inspiration. For a simple reason. It's quoted more than once in the New Testament. Paul quotes from it twice, and he refers to 2 different moments in the book of Job as if he were real. And that is sufficient to say, look, it's kind of like we'll see Jonah. Was there really a man that was swallowed by a fish and stayed in the belly of a fish for 3 days? Well, some or many might believe it to be just fictional, but that is not what the New Testament and Jesus implies. Was the story of Job and his loss of everything that he had and his struggles in finding meaning, is that just a made-up story to discuss, why does a good man suffer? Well, that's not what, again, is implied by other references to this book. The implications are, it's a real story. Now, you can do what you want to with it now as you read it, but it's a real story. So, the historical nature of the book. A few other things before I continue. Are we to take the events described in it, especially the first 2 chapters, then the last chapter as it ends, the prose, narrative, story parts, are we to take them as true? Yes, we are, in my opinion. And these are the reasons for believing a few of them. First of all, the very style that I mentioned of the opening and close of the book that starts in prose and they conform to other types of biblical narratives that are historical. For example, you can see other examples in the Bible in 1 Samuel 1, in Luke 1, that it follows kind of that model. A second reason I think you should take the story as real In Ezekiel 14:14, Job is mentioned along with Noah and Daniel. Noah is a real figure. Daniel is a real figure. Job is mentioned with them. They're mentioned as real historical figures of history. Thirdly, James, the stepbrother of the Lord, writer in the New Testament, refers to Job as an example of perseverance. Not just the story of Job is about perseverance, but Job is an example of perseverance, and thus he implies the story is very real. There may be other reasons, but that's just a few reasons for which your instructor believes strongly. Take it or leave it, but Job is real. Now, when we said we don't know the century, but how about the geographical setting? Well, geographically speaking, the life, the cultural context of Job puts him in the patriarchal period. So somewhere between the Great Flood and Moses. As I suggested, I would place him around the same century as Abraham, somewhere in around 2000 before Christ. There are never any references to the law of Moses, so it doesn't exist when the story of Job takes place. There is a mention in chapter 22, verse 16, of a flood. Now, it may be a localized flood rather than a general flood, but there is a mention of a flood there. Other reasons for which we can start pinpointing the cultural context of the story of Job is that he functions not just as a wealthy landowner, a father of many children, but also he's a priest who offers sacrifices for his family. And that is something that is very similar to what we see Abraham doing during his time. See in Genesis 12, verse 7. So that again kind of points to patriarchal times around the second millennium before Christ. Also, Job, we don't know exactly how old he was when he lost everything that he had been given. But he does live, one might figure out at least 200 years, if not longer. And his long length of life, his longevity, is typical again of what we saw in the Numbers with patriarchs. What we do know from as the story ends in chapter 42 and verse 16, is that he lives 140 years after he experiences all these losses and terrible suffering. So some might say at least 200, 210, maybe more. Because he already had, when the story opens, 10 children, and he was very influential in his time, and so that at least implies 50, 60, 70 years, and so he's at least 200 or more when he dies. So again, I've returned to, because of the setting, cultural setting, I return to that date of around the time of Abraham of 2000 before Christ. Where did he live? So the geographical setting seems to, the hints that were given of a true story to put us in the Middle East, of course, maybe in the areas that we call Oman, or Lebanon today, along the northern coast, north of Israel, maybe possibly in the areas of Turkey. You're looking at kind of you're looking at the journey that Abraham made from Ur to Haran and then down to the promised land. Well, look up in those areas just around Haran, and maybe that's the setting where this took place. This is another map that shows you, again, the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea. Please see the Arabian Desert, and the green area is the country that today in modern times is called Oman, the country of Oman, at the tip end of the Arabian Peninsula. Some say that maybe Job lived in this particular area here. One other map that kind of gives us a topographical map that gives you the area of the modern day countries of Saudi Arabia. Look at the bottom, the Arabian Desert, then Jordan, Syria, Iraq. Again, in this area is where we need to posit the story of this patriarch called Job. who is a wealthy, rich man, rich in many things, including children, and then the terrible tragedy that besets him, and then the discussion with sages, three of them in particular, friends they're called, that come to debate with him. What has he done to bring upon himself such tremendous losses? And then a fourth young man that appears at the end. So four discussions, dialogues of sages that spend time, days, weeks, talking to a mourning Job about his condition. Now, to make a quick end to this survey of the book of Job and his story, a man who had everything loses it all except for his life, and is left to ponder, what did I do? And then discuss it with these sages friends of his. And then, of course, the resolution where God steps in and answers some of the questions of Job, and then restores completely everything that he had lost and even more. What can one say if you were to read these 42 wonderful chapters, great piece of literature of ancient times in the Old Testament, therefore inspired, as quoted by even the Apostle Paul and others? The purpose of the book of Job, the purposes actually, here are some suggestions that I might make. Well, it's to answer first and foremost the question, why does bad stuff happen to good people? Why do the righteous suffer? Righteous being good people. Why does bad stuff happen to good people? Here are some quick answers that you're going to find if you delve into the book of Job. We're not able, from our perspective as human beings here on earth, to come to a conclusion, get full answers to some of the most painful experiences and losses. We cannot fully bring, with our reason, our rationality, a meaningful analysis. We're not going to understand everything. Man simply cannot tie all the loose ends of God's purposes in bringing things about or letting things happen. We have to, in a sense, learn to trust God, which is the journey that Job makes. He wants to figure it out. His friends insist that he figure it out, but not God will step in at the end and say, you're going to have to trust me. One thing that we do find out is that the common held idea that if something bad happens to you, you sinned or your parents sinned, well, the proclamation of the book of Job, the wisdom that comes out of the book of Job, is that suffering is not always the result of personal sin. Now, sometimes we make big mistakes and we have consequences. Sometimes other people make mistakes and we are collateral damage. Sometimes because we live in a fallen world, things happen. Sometimes nature with the hurricanes and disasters and diseases brings things. But here's the point that is made by the book of Job. Suffering is not always the result of personal sin. Job's sages, friends, they are wrong in the conclusion that suffering is always a consequence of sin. A lot of suffering is a consequence of somebody's sin, but not all. Job proves this is not the case in his investigation. We know from the first two chapters of the book of Job that he didn't deserve, if we want to use that word, he didn't deserve anything that happens to him. Even though he's not a perfect man, he does realize his sin. He offers offerings for the sin not only of himself but his children, because he's concerned about their sin. So he is a man that knows about sin, and he can't figure out why then did all the bad stuff, all of his children were killed, all of his loss of material, his cattle, why does all that happen to him? Here's a second reason, another purpose for the book of Job. It defends the absolute majesty, glory, and perfection of God. It paints again a picture of a God that is righteous and good. This is a theme that is echoed often in the wisdom books of the Old Testament. See Psalm 18 and verse 3. I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised. So the purpose of the book of Job is to say, no matter what happens, when you can't explain it, God is still deserving of praise simply on the basis of who he is, not just because good stuff is happening to you and you are rich and you are healthy and you're famous and you have a good life, as a man might define it. God is worthy of praise apart from the blessings that he bestows. Now, a central character in the book of Job is, of course, Satan, or Satan, as we might call him, the adversary who tries to put a kink in the interpretation of Job. He is sure that men will only serve God if God gives us good stuff. That is, we basically are bought off by God, and if we don't get rewarded by God with a good life and wealth and rich and famous, we will not serve God. And so he tries to prove that point. Satan fails, as Job does not go that route, but he struggles. Job does prove Satan wrong in the end, but Job struggles to want to know the reason for everything that happens to him. And the fact is, we're not going to know it, and we're going to have to still trust God. A third reason, a purpose for the book of Job, is to answer an ageless question. I mentioned that the religion of Buddhism addresses this as the greatest issue of mankind, of the human condition, how to deal with suffering. Well, the Bible addresses suffering, but it again says that's not your biggest problem, man. Sin is your problem. Suffering is a collateral side effect of sin, but not always a personal sin, as we said. The book of Job tries to deal with the age-old question: why do we suffer? Who or what caused it? Why does a child have leukemia? Why does cancer and a long protracted death impact good people? People that are good. Why doesn't God do something about genocide, human genocide, and other big disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, nature-driven, you could say, catastrophes? The answer of the book of Job is going to be that not all questions are answered, first of all, but some important points will be made. And they are. Man is unable to subject the painful experiences of the human existence to a meaningful analysis. We come back to that fact. We are not meant to, in our human condition, to have all of the answers. Some are left to God, and we must trust him. Secondly, suffering is not always a result of personal sins. So, when a disease hits a child, or when a child is born with a physical defect, it's not the sin of the parents. That is an incorrect view of what's going on. Thirdly, suffering may be allowed as a complement to one's own spirituality. That is, sometimes we need to view suffering as not necessarily welcome, but as something that is an opportunity to develop trust in God, to become stronger. So suffering is not always evil. It must be seen in a different light, and it is not forever. Another purpose that might be mentioned, a couple more, and then we'll stop our focus here, is that it does lead, if one addresses suffering in the correct way, mentally and physically, it can lead to a virtue, a good thing called patience. The book of Job paints a beautiful picture of patience. The Greek word, book of Job is in Hebrew poetry, but the Greek word for patience is hypomone, which describes the trait of one who's able to abide under the weight of trial. Somebody that endures and keeps a positive spirit and doesn't let it break him or her down. That is definitely something that comes out of the experience of Job as described in this 4,000-year-old book or narrative. From the patience of Job, we learn that what it means to maintain fidelity to God, even under great trials in which we do not understand exactly what is happening. So, very important effect of enduring trials is to develop patience. Lastly, another purpose that might be suggested of the book of Job, it prepares the way for the coming of Jesus. Now, that may not be obvious, but here is why that might be said. The coming of Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, is seen in that Job, when he tries to insist that God answer his questions, that God give him a day in court, so to speak, so he can defend himself and say, I didn't do anything wrong. Why is this stuff happening to me? Well, Job longs for what you might call a defense lawyer, a mediator. He would like somebody that will more organized way, in a better way, defend him from what are perceived to be maybe accusations or charges. His friends seem to say, look, you must have done something wrong. Why don't you just repent of it, and then maybe it'll go away. And he says, but I don't know what I've done wrong. I need a defense lawyer before God, so to speak. And Jesus is portrayed as a mediator between man and God. That is, therefore, an important role that Job yearns for, and that we will see Jesus fulfill when he comes. See the letter of Paul of 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. The concept of a redeemer, not just mediator, but also redeemer, can be viewed in this context too. Job confesses his faith in a redeemer, important word, who would one day come. Well, Christ is that redeemer. So in that sense, the book of Job prefigures the need for and the coming of Christ as mediator and redeemer. This concludes a quick focus on the book of Job.